11 years in the making, the Marvel Cinematic Universe now has 23 films, with the most recent addition of Spider-Man Far From Home, and now it's time to go back and rank them from the worst to the best. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema, but before we do my ranking on the MCU movies, I'd love to hear yours down in comments below. What was the worst? What was the best of all of the films? And be sure to be respectful of everyone's other's opinions, because we're all gonna have different picks. We may even have unpopular opinions. We also don't forget to like this video and subscribe. So without further ado, let's move on to number 23. And at number 23 we have Iron Man 2. And the problem with this movie is this movie tries to set up too many stories. It goes into the Avengers, it goes into the SHIELD setup, and all of those things. The relationship with Tony and his father, Tony, and the public and everyone around them. And the problem with that is it makes the story drag on. And on top of that, we got two very mediocre villains that try and work well together, but their chemistry does not work together, which makes this movie last on my list. And at number 22, we have Avengers Age of Ultron. And this movie also has too many plot lines it tries to dive into. And it also tries to introduce us to new characters such as Quicksilver, Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, as well as Vision. And the problem with that is they try and spend too much time with those characters, but it's still not enough time for us to really care and understand all of the abilities and what the characters are wanting to do with their powers, which just jumbles into the kind of messy and slow plot with Ultron. Moving on to number 21, we have Thor: The Dark World, and I actually think I like this film a bit more than others do, as it gives a new sort of dark tone to the MCU in this movie, and it also expands some of the cosmic reality and universe of the MCU, but it still doesn't excuse the fact where some of the villain is very unforgettable, as the main dark elf is just as normal as the other dark elves, and there's nothing really special about him. And on top of that, we get another fake Loki's death. My pick for number 20 would be The Incredible Hulk. And what's frustrating about this film is that I really enjoy it a lot more, and I think it's one of the more underrated films of the MCU. It's still sort of an average story, but it still does a good job at explaining how Hulk is done. And I feel that Edward Norton does a little bit of a better job, at least starting off, than Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk and Bruce Banner. Unfortunately, as this movie was made as one part of the first movies of the MCU, some of the humor just does not land well for me. It doesn't seem like they have the story format executed as well. My pick for number 19 is Captain America: The First Avenger, and while the first 2/3 of the movie does a really good job and is the most compelling of the story of how Steve Rogers becomes Captain America, in the last third of the movie it just doesn't work too well. The fights were fairly good and the story still is pretty smooth, but it just doesn't work as well for me. And Red Skull is not as a compelling villain to me, as they don't really give him a whole lot to do. He's killed off pretty easily, and overall this is just a pretty average movie. Number 18, we have Thor, and what this film does really well is developing the story of not only Thor's character, but also bringing in the cosmic reality of the MCU for the very first time. And they do a very good job at adding in Asgard and having all these fun, lovable characters. But where this film falls a little flat is not giving as much character to some of the other heroes and side characters. And while there's not a whole lot of depth to any of the villains, seeing Thor being able to defeat the greatest villain of his own ego makes for a fun and interesting story that even works within this Shakespearean style movie. Moving on to number 17, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And while all of this movie does some good moments, has some good emotional moments, especially at the end with Yondu's death, that actually made me cry, this movie still is kind of slow paced. Some of the moments between Peter Quill and his father don't really work out for me. They're kind of weird. Just playing catch with his dad with a cosmic ball. Also, even though this is a Guardians of the Galaxy film that's supposed to be a group movie, there's many times where the group is split up. They have their own subplot, which works for the story they're trying to tell, but it just doesn't have that same flavor when they're all together. Moving on to number 16, we have the original Ant-Man. And while this isn't a horrible movie by any means, the stakes are pretty ant-sized. There's nothing really in this movie that makes you antsy. We still get a good introduction to all the lovable characters and great humor that's into this mix, especially as we get a great story of Paul Rudd as the Ant-Man and Scott Lang starts as a criminal and becomes a superhero. Moving on to number 15, we have Captain America the Winter Soldier. And while I see there's a lot of fun added into the mix, there's good fight sequences and relationship between the Winter Soldier, Black Widow, and Captain America, and there's a good villain added into a mix that has a clever scheme. This movie never really excited me, as all of the action seems to go slow. All of the story doesn't have to have something extra special added to the mix. So overall, this movie, it just goes a little bit farther down on my list. Although I think it's a good movie, there's nothing particularly really exciting about it. To number 14, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp. And with this film, they up the antics and they really have a fun heist adventure that you don't have to worry about huge world-saving problems that most of the other MCU films involve. And with some of the characters and humor in this, you get to love it a little bit more than the previous film because they all add in some little mixture, and they, especially with Hank Pym, they give him a lot more charismatic character with his smart remarks. But I will say with the villain of the Ghost, there's nothing too special about her, and the reveal of who she's with is just a tiny bit anticlimactic. Number 13, we have Iron Man 3, and while I wish I could rank it just a little bit higher, the villains is really what drags this movie down. Aldrin Killian has good fight sequences and brings a good battle, but doesn't have too much behind his character. Mandarin was a little disappointing just finding the reveal of him as being an actor. The reason I like this film so much and what I see a lot of people overlook is most of this film, Tony is without his suit. It shows to go the message of if he's nothing without his suit, then he doesn't deserve it. The final battle of this film is one of my favorite of the MCU final battles, and it just makes for a great movie, but unfortunately the villains bring it a little bit down. Moving on to number 12, we have Doctor Strange, and this introduces a new character that has a great development from being a doctor to being a master of the mystic arts, and all of the visuals within it, with all of the bending reality, creates for some great shots. And Benedict Cumberbatch does a super good job at portraying Doctor Strange, and although his relationship with his girlfriend isn't super compelling, and some of the villains just sort of are a little sidelined and don't have a ton of story to them, this movie still is pretty good. And at number 11, we have Spider-Man Homecoming, and this film skips over Spider-Man's origin story, which leaves more room to understand his character than what we already got in Civil War. And you get to understand more of him and relate to him more of a character and see him more as a high schooler, because they do a lot better with that aspect of things with his Spider-Man role than they do with some of the other Spider-Man adaptations. Also, the inclusion of Iron Man is nice, and the humor works really well. The Vulture villain is even better, as you really get to understand his character, his intentions behind stealing things, as you get to see he's only doing it to make money for his family and care for his family, and not just to destroy random things, do random things, and wreak havoc. Moving on to my top 10, some of these decisions were super hard to make. It was hard to really get down and narrow down because all of these are pretty close together in what I would rate them personally. But I'd love to hear what you would rank all of these MCU movies from the worst to the best. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. But without further ado, let's go on to my top 10. Moving on to number 10, we have the very first film that started it all, Iron Man. And this film is super nostalgic to me as it takes references that adds up ending up being in future movies, but also the future movies end up building this film up as well, as it still works well. It set the MCU formula that works really well, especially for the origin side of things. The way he becomes the man he is, the Iron Man, just works really well. And the villain isn't the greatest of the villains we've gotten, but all of the story just flows really nice. His relationship with all of the characters he interacts with works well, and even the Rhodey character in this works better than Tom Cheadle, in my opinion, until some of the later movies we've gotten. Number 9, we have the Black Panther, and this movie does a really good job of portraying Black Panther's character leading off from the Civil War. And the way they integrate the culture makes it for a lot more interesting of a movie. They add in a lot of cinematography and great visuals added into a mix. And on top of that, we get a really good villain that you can really understand where he's coming from, what he's wanting to do. And overall, that makes Black Panther a pretty rewatchable movie. Number 8, we have what probably most of you put near the bottom of your list, Captain Marvel. And for me, this makes for a fun film. There's a lot of energy within the mix, and the way they control Captain Marvel hides her character, which is a little downside, but I like that part of it, because for an overpowered character, you really have to fight against the ego, just like they do with Thor. You have to fight against the ego, you have to fight against her physically and mentally, which really is what controls her. It causes the conflict within that. And the way the Kree are able to stop her for so many years before she finds out her true past and who she really is, that also ends up making this a really good movie. The energy within this movie is great, and especially Talos added into the mix, and a young, fun, charismatic Nick Fury and Agent Coulson makes for a great set of characters. And with all the visuals and fight sequences added into a mix, I gotta put this at my number 8 spot. Number 7, we have Captain America: The Civil War, and this is a movie that really split the fandom in half. You get Team Cap or Team Iron Man. I'm on Team Iron Man. Let me know down in the comments below what team you're on. And I just really like the brawl that goes on between the allies, and it ends up splitting the tides for Infinity War. And with all the characters that you get in the mix and the added Black Panther character you introduce into the story, and the great villain that ends up having the plan that's able to split the Avengers apart, makes for this a really good movie. And moving on to number 6, we have the third movie in the Thor franchise, Thor Ragnarok. And this film, just like Captain Marvel, has a ton of energy. It has a lot of laughs. It has a great soundtrack. And the way they took Thor makes for a really great character. And to add to that, we get the Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie and Tom Hiddleston as Loki. Within all of that, we get Hela, a really good villain that ends up actually leading to the destruction of Asgard. And the themes woven into all of the different movies makes for a really good story. And at number 5, we have the original Avengers, and the way they integrate all of the characters into this, bring all the characters together, really works well. And even today, rewatching it, it still works just as well. All of the characters woven into the mix, all of their personalities, the conflict of bringing them together, and then them learning to work together. And what puts this so high on my list is that the fact that Loki and the Chitauri actually almost managed to defeat the Avengers on that very day, on that very final battle. And the final battle is such a classic, and all of the other movies build off of it, and all of the future movies build onto it. Therefore, we may have a little bit of a controversial pick. We have Avengers Endgame. And what this movie does well is the last hour of the movie does super good job exploring the long battle, and the way they get up to it within the time travel story makes for a really good story. The part that kind of drags this movie down is they can't really find the right pacing for this movie. Like I said, more of the last hour or so just had a fast pace. Some of the movie is kind of slow. Some has a medium pace, and some of the pacing is just all over the place. And some of the content within the movie didn't seem like it totally needed to be there. The humor was good. Some of the jokes played off a little bit too strong, so it didn't work because it was overdone. So with all the problems it has, and with all of the good, huge moments it has, and favors it does for the fandom, ultimately this leaves me to want to rank it lower, but also to rank it higher. So it just leaves me really stuck in the middle, but because of the huge moments, I still have to at least rank it at number 4. Number 3, we have Guardians of the Galaxy, and this is a good film that was one of the more surprising films when it came out, and it works well, and it still works well even today, with all of the weird, quirky characters, all the charismatic differences between each character, and they have to learn to get together as they ultimately end up falling together as they move on with the story. And the team that forms just ends up working really well with all the problems they have with each other, but then they end up coming together in the end to settle their differences, and it makes for a super good movie that makes you even cry when a tree dies. Number 2 and number 1 on my list are kind of a toss-up, but my number 2 pick for now is Spider-Man Far From Home. This movie came out with a really big boom, as it had a lot of energy, it had a lot of surprises integrated within the mix. All of the characters are lovable, and the way they portray all of the characters, Spider-Man, Mysterio, MJ, Ned, and all of those characters as the side characters just works really well. All of the chemistry works really well together, and all of the surprises that it brings out to the table just brings a great flavor and new flavor to the MCU. And all of the tension and energy this brought just put me on the edge of my seat as I watched it. But at number 1, we have Avengers Infinity War, and what this movie does so well is bringing out a great cast of characters, all of the Avengers brought into one, but because of Civil War they're divided, and that ultimately leads to some conflict, but also division between how the war takes place, war in different places. There's so many fight sequences, but they also bring the Guardians of the Galaxy into the Avengers for the first time, which brings for some great battles and great storytelling, which ultimately brings in one of the greater villains of all time. But Thanos has such a strong opinion and bias toward his plans, and believes what he is doing is right, that you almost understand and really care for what he's trying to do within that. But that was just my ranking on all 23 MCU movies, and I'd love to hear yours down on comments below. Let me know what your worst are, what your best are, or just your whole list altogether, and I'd really appreciate those comments. Be respectful of others' opinions, because we're all gonna have different opinions, different ways of looking at all the movies, and let me know some reasoning behind some of that. But don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because I'll be back for more movie reviews, rankings, and more on the way.